Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something totally fascinating and honestly deeply human. We're going to explore exactly how a society goes about piecing its history back together after going through a period of profound trauma. Specifically, we'll be looking at the National Human Rights Museum in Taiwan. We are going to unpack how they navigate the incredibly delicate process of collecting, preserving, and displaying artifacts from the era of authoritarian rule, a period known as the White Terror. It's a journey through the politics of memory, the ethics of archiving, and how we remember what the state actively tried to erase. Now, to really set the stage here, I want to start with this incredibly powerful quote from Primo Levi, which our source text actually uses to anchor this whole discussion. It goes, "Those who touched the bottom, those who saw the Gorgon and turned to stone, could not return to tell the tale. Or even if they did return, they were already mute." Just think about that for a second. It sets a really contemplative tone, right? It reminds us of all the victims of history whose voices were permanently silenced by state violence. How do you recover the voices of those who are made mute? Well, that is the monumental task of a human rights archive. And this is what a surviving fragment of memory actually looks like. It's not some grand official wax-sealed historical document. This is literally just a torn piece of a calendar, May 28th, 1950, to be exact. A university student named Jiang Min Quan desperately tore this from a calendar in an interrogation room right as she was arrested, just so she could remember the exact date she lost her freedom. She kept it hidden on her person. So when we talk about recovering history, we aren't just talking about thick government files. We're talking about these small, desperate artifacts of survival. Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, Missing Pieces of History. For decades, the official historical records of Taiwan's authoritarian era effectively erased the humanity of political victims. If you only looked at the official government archives, your image of these individuals would be completely warped. The official records are just full of this cold, criminalizing language. Charges of treason, subverting the government, failing to report spies. These state files completely erase the life, the struggles, and the actual humanity of the person before and after they were thrown in prison. But contrast that with the private human rights archives collected by the museum. We're talking about diaries, unsent letters, personal items. These private archives stitch the victim's perspective back into the timeline, providing a much-needed contrast to the state's bureaucratic erasure. A really perfect example of this contrast is something entirely mundane, like a standard delivery slip. Families use these to send food, maybe a winter coat or stationery into the prison. It's mundane, yeah, but deeply profound. This simple piece of paper, noting the delivery of a favorite dish, acts as this powerful antidote to state erasure. It reminds us that these were real people with families who loved them, waiting on the outside. It restores the humanity that the official court verdicts tried so hard to strip away. Which brings us to Section 2, the threefold restoration, or stitching history. When highly personal artifacts are brought into a public institution, they go through what the source material brilliantly describes as a threefold restoration. Think of this as the complex journey an artifact takes from hiding in a victim's damp closet for decades, all the way to sitting under bright museum lights. It involves three distinct processes: physical restoration, narrative stitching, and institutional restructuring. It is quite literally the act of stitching history back together, one fragment at a time. Let's break these down. First step, we have physical restoration. And wow, these documents are incredibly delicate. You've got fragile prison letters, handwritten notebooks, and they almost always arrive heavily damaged. Because these files were kept in private homes, literally stashed under beds or in humid environments just to hide them from authorities, they're usually in way worse condition than your average, well-kept government file. But here's the catch. The challenge of physical restoration isn't actually about the technology used to fix the paper. It raises a massive philosophical question. Which stains do you clean, and which do you keep as historical evidence of trauma? Look at it this way. If a letter has a deep crease because a prisoner had to aggressively fold it to hide it from the guards, that crease is historical evidence. But what if there are water stains on the paper because a family member wept over it 30 years later? Do you clean that off to return it to its original state? I mean, what even is the original state of an artifact born out of trauma? Every single choice a conservator makes shapes how we'll eventually remember that object. Once the physical repair lays the groundwork, we move into the second phase, narrative stitching. This is where the human perspective is finally stitched back into the torn fabric of history. It actively counters the official state narrative. A really prime example from the archives is the prison diary of Liang Linghui, a female political prisoner. Reading her diary, you don't just see a criminal file. You see a woman actively maintaining her faith and self-awareness while under constant surveillance. It provides this crucial, much-needed space to hold what was previously just unspeakable suffering. Then there's the third phase, institutional restructuring. This is all about dealing with the messy, real-world bureaucracy of the whole thing. Remember, these aren't public records. They're highly sensitive personal diaries and letters. The museum has to navigate complex legal hurdles, clearing copyrights, addressing strict privacy laws, and tracking down families to properly transfer rights. The source text makes a great point here. In doing all this hard work, the museum is actually repairing the institutional trust between the state and the victims. The state is basically proving it can finally be a responsible guardian of these memories. All right, let's move on to Section 3, from evidence to artifact, a complex shift. This leads us right into a major complication highlighted in our sources. What exactly happens when a raw historical archive officially becomes a protected, curated museum artifact? Now, you might think, well, that's entirely a good thing, it's being preserved, but the reality on the ground is actually a lot more complex. Because the National Human Rights Museum operates largely as a museum rather than an open archive, these items undergo a process called artifactization. In a pure archive evidence system, researchers can freely browse through files, flip through pages, and view documents in their original context alongside other related papers. But in a museum object display, the item gets locked behind glass. It becomes isolated. It gets treated as this precious visual object to look at rather than an open book of evidence to read and analyze. And the cost of this artifactization is pretty significant. It fragments the historical context. For example, in a museum system, a handwritten letter, a photograph, and an official court verdict regarding the exact same person might end up separated simply because they're made of different materials. So a researcher looking for the holistic story now faces incredibly high barriers. You can't just request the folder anymore. You have to apply for special access to handle protected cultural assets. Ultimately, the visual display ends up taking priority over the textual evidence. Finally, we arrive at Section 4, Art and Memory Politics, Translating Trauma. To bridge the gap between locked-away artifacts and the general public, the museum has increasingly turned to modern art. But this involves some highly subjective political choices. The sources discuss the harsh reality of memory allocation. Think about it. Even if the museum collects thousands of letters, they obviously can't display everything. Curators naturally gravitate toward victims with really unique backgrounds or whose artifacts are highly visual and striking. This means certain stories are repeatedly told and brought into the light, while hundreds of other victim stories, maybe lacking a visually compelling artifact, remain completely hidden in the dark corners of the storage room. But when they do bring those unique stories to light, the results can be absolutely stunning. Take a look at this. Incredibly, this is a political prisoner, Tu Ping Lang, actually performing a traditional play right alongside the prison warden. They even modified old military uniforms to make the costumes. Today, the museum uses this kind of history for artistic translation, effectively turning static archives into modern plays and immersive soundscapes so the public can emotionally connect with the trauma of the past on a much deeper level. Now, this kind of artistic translation is a real double-edged sword. It has huge benefits, for sure. It evokes deep empathy and gives visitors a physical, sensory experience of the history. But as the text warns us, it definitely has its limits. It's highly dependent on the curator's aesthetic selection, and there is an ever-present risk of altering, over-dramatizing, or even inadvertently romanticizing the raw truth of that suffering. Which leaves us with this heavy, lingering question. If art and museums must inevitably select which memories to show, whose suffering is left in the dark? As we've seen today, unearthing history isn't just about finding old papers in a closet. It's about the constant, difficult choices of how we stitch those fragments together and whose story ultimately gets to be told. It's a really powerful reminder to think critically about how any nation's history is curated and presented to us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today, and keep asking those tough questions.